And this week I'd like to expand a little bit more on the qualitative instrumentation. So just to tie the dots, last week you heard me talk about the qualitative methods. So we switched from the quantitative, which gives us the perspective of numbers, to the qualitative, which is more of opinions and information. You might remember that I mentioned that we collect information. So this week we are going to continue talking about that information, but this time we're going to talk a little bit more about those instrumentation components. So essentially, I'm going to cover two things. One is going to be the considerations we have to have in some of the instruments, and the other one is going to go over some of the questions that help you create those instruments. The one thing that I like to tell you right off the bat is for qualitative data collection purposes, we usually are going to come up with questions. So the word questionnaire is usually fitting within a qualitative measurement or data gathering activity. The thing is, we usually have questionnaires that can also lead to surveys that generally, depending on how we ask people to respond to them, are going to give us quantitative data. So that's the one thing that you guys have to remember. So just because we're saying questionnaires does not necessarily mean one or the other. A questionnaire is going to definitely give us the opportunity to collect data in two different formats and two different types, the qualitative and the quantitative. So it can be either or, depending on how we expect the respondent to give us the information. So let's jump straight to the first one. So for that, I have actually added an article, the data collection. Let me actually switch to that. Data collection methods. This is a reading that I have for this week. So whenever you guys get a chance, you can go ahead and open it and read it in full context. But I wanted to highlight a couple of things. So this chapter, as a matter of fact, it's from Gittens, who used to be a professor also in this program, talks about the methodologies. So the approach in data collection tasks, and notice how he talks about interviews, questionnaires, observations, organizational records, and then concludes from all of those. You may recall also that last week I mentioned that organizational records or records in generally are a type of observation. So it's just a semantical differentiation, I believe. And so you have to be careful, and for the purpose of our hat, you want to be more explicit in terms of what type of observation are you doing. For example, if you're going to do an observation of records, you do want to say that. But if you just say you did an observation and then your narrative does talk about retrospective data, things that you looked at that happened in previous years or decades, but you don't say that you looked at records from an observation perspective, then that can get confusing. And what we want to make sure is that you verbalize exactly what you're doing so you can speak to it. Okay, so let's start with the approaching the data collection tasks. So notice how in this chapter, one of the advices that they have is that we should use more than one data collection type. And you probably have heard me talk about this. I have mentioned that in the past, where when you're going to do your hat project, it is possible that you may have enough data from one single source. Either you had an interview with the owner of some company or with a couple of people, or you may have gathered data, and that's going to give you all that you need. But for the purpose of our practice and for the purpose of this class, I have asked you to try to make sure that you include at least two forms of data collection types. Not only you have the ability to practice, but you also can understand the responses or the results that each one of them yield to you and what information is available for you to conclude and then come back with some recommendations, etc. So this goes along with what we are reading on the screen right now. Use more than one method. Another thing is to look at the strengths and weaknesses Uh, for the qualitative perspective, which is what we are talking about this week, you may remember that I have said in the past the challenge of the qualitative data is that you have to comb through a lot of information. In other words, when you are collecting that responses from the folks that are responding to your interview or your focus group, you have to code those answers, and then you have to count, and then you have to interpret that data. So it's a lot of real-time reading that has to occur, especially if you let people talk for hours on end and you're having a tape recorder and then you're capturing all of that. Then you have to play it back and transcribe it, and then you have to reread it and code it and categorize it, and then you have to come back and see where the connecting dots or representations are, because coding the data and theming it does not give you the entire perspective. So it is, there are some weaknesses to the qualitative piece, but at the same time, some of the strengths about it is that it gives you rich information that is not necessarily open for interpretation. A number can be interpreted one way or another, whereas a person's opinion is a person's opinion. So if you need more information, you can ask on the spot. So there are some strengths and weaknesses about the qualitative methodologies, but you have to find the balance between the two. As far as the method versus the questions, essentially, I like how this paragraph is talking about you letting the analysis question determine what the method is going to be, and not the other way around. So in other words, think about this. Just because a survey is easy to code and it's easy to manipulate in Excel or one of those statistical programs, does not necessarily mean that you're always going to go with a survey that is quantitative in nature, or vice versa. Just because you want to get context and have a rich answer doesn't mean you're always going to have a qualitative interview. It really depends. So what I ask you here at this point, and the biggest nugget to take away from this method versus question, is ask yourself, what is it that you're trying to find? If your question leads you to identified frequency, to identified averages, to identify instances where something has happened or how many times something has happened, which is of numerical value, then it's almost telling you that you should use a quantitative data collection method. Now, on the contrary, if your needs analysis is asking you more things of depth, perspective, a correlation, etc., you definitely, understanding even, I will use that word, you definitely want to lean more towards the qualitative method. And if you want to be very comprehensive in your needs analysis, you probably want to do both. You want to have the strength of the numbers, so averages, frequencies, etc. And if you also want to know the perspective of why certain things are average, why certain things repeat so much, or why so many things are so frequently happening in the place of consultation that you are going at, then you probably want to use both. But that's what this paragraph is talking about, the method versus the question. So make sure you know what you're looking for, and then let that guide you in terms of what method you're going to use. But of course, if you go 2 paragraphs up, you have to use more than one. That doesn't necessarily mean use only 2 qualitative or use only 2 quantitative, but it doesn't also say use one of each. So it's a matter of you using your best judgment, okay? And then let me shift to the interviews over here. Interviews is one of the qualitative methods that we're going to use, and if you remember, we talked about it in class, where the challenge of the interviews is that you have limited capacity. The more people you want to interview, the more time it's going to take you, or the more manpower you're going to need to expand the capability to ask X number of questions to X number of people. And of course, the more you ask, the more responses you get, the more decoding you have to do, the more theming you have to do, the more categorization you have to do. So that's the challenge you have to keep in mind when you go for the interviews. So if you scroll down for this paragraph over here, you can see some examples of some of the questions. So, have I done my homework? Am I talking to the best possible person, or would someone else be able to offer a more accurate account of the situation? Am I getting straight information? Some of these questions will help you actually keep the interview on task. One of the biggest challenges of interviewing someone is that if you end up with someone who is very talkative, like myself, you're probably going to get more information than you really need. And if you need to keep the clock ticking, then you probably want to reel that person in and keep them on task. So here's an idea. That's what these questions are doing. They're giving you an example of how you can keep the person on task. And you have to be really good moderators, because remember that if you're very forceful or if you're dismissive, you're going to disengage the respondent and you're not going to get their participation, or you're going to get biased participation, in which case you're going to have to scratch their answers. So you have to be careful. So on the next page we have, this is interesting, diagnosing organizational performance by means of some questions. And I'm not necessarily going to talk through everything, but I wanted to show you, for example. So number one, the description of the interview techniques. The interviewer and interviewee talk alone or in small groups, and the interviewer asks questions to get information. Well, that sounds logical, correct? It's never a bad idea to spell out exactly what is going to happen, because if this were a focus group, this description of the focus group technique would be different, right? You would have to establish what the sequence of answering and how people can indicate they want to say something so they don't cut somebody else off, etc. So it's a different protocol. So staying with the interviews though, types. Number two, there are three different types of interviews. There is a structured interview, unstructured interview, and then there's a combination of the two. So the structured interview is pretty much an interview that has predetermined questions. You already know what you're going to ask, and you're going to try to not deviate from the person answering more than you are asking them. The benefit of doing that sometimes is that you keep the person on task, you go straight through. Technically, the time should be enough that you allocated for the interview, and you don't end up with more information for decoding and categorization. However, you are running the risk of not getting all the information that you need to determine whether or not there is a gap or a problem. So there are setbacks too. Number two of types is the unstructured interview. So that basically you let the person just go at it, right? You give one question and then you just let them go, let them rip. And at the same time, the person may end up going on a tangent. And so it's your choice as a moderator of that interview whether or not you want the person to go on a tangent and let them be on that tangent, or if you want to bring them back in, or for how long. And then the third one is the combination of the two. So you can have a number of minutes, say 15 minutes. Of those, 5 minutes will be of structured questions and the other 10 minutes will be of unstructured questions, right? So you can do, and of course I'm just giving you an example of minutes. Usually an interview for the purpose of data collection is going to take a little bit more than 15 minutes, usually. As far as the uses, notice a couple. I'm not going to read all of them, but a couple of them. To establish rapport for other data gatherings, to get details of work protocols, to learn about plans and projects, and depending on what you are dealing with, satisfaction, disengagement, culture problems, etc. So depending on what you want to find out, very, very, very good for the different uses. Key skills that you need: have the ability to develop questions that will get meaningful answers, and we talked a little bit about this in class. Depending on the question you ask is going to turn off or is going to really engage your respondent. So you have to decide which way you want to go. Another thing that I would say here is know a little bit the type of person that you're going to be interviewing. If you know where this person comes from, then you probably are going to be more successful and you're going to get more information out of that person by using some colloquialisms, some words that this person or the people that you're going to interview are more familiar with. Usually the company jargon, some of the cultural factors that surround the company, or factors of the trade. There are some some industries or some businesses that actually revolve around certain terminology. So you probably want to get familiar with it so you can, kind of build that rapport, etc. And then we move to the number 5, the pros and the cons. And I'm not going to read these to you. I'm going to let you guys read those. As I mentioned before, interviews do run with pros and cons. So as we continue on, then you can see that we have some content around the telephone interviews. Basically, it's the same as above. The difference is, you guessed it, on a telephone interview, we cannot see the person's body language. So it is a little more difficult and very impersonal for us to, even though we're talking to a person, knowing what that person is really feeling about answering that question. Versus when we are face to face, we can see whether the person is grinching or the person is squatting or the person is just giving you a face of horror. And so you can read into that as well, and of course you will be interpreting that in a certain way. On a phone interview, the most you can interpret is silence, so it's difficult, or how quickly a person responds. Then you have the group interviews, or essentially the focus groups, and we're going to close with this one for this article. So the focus groups, as we mentioned before, are really good because they will give you perspective in a non-controlled group, but at the same time you have some risks because the moment you increase the number of people that you're talking to at the same time, the harder it's going to be for you to extract true and good information to use. So it really has its pros and its cons. So this is this article, and then it goes into the questionnaires, which is what I was telling you. Just because you see questionnaire here does not necessarily take you straight into the surveys, which is the quantitative methodology. But instead, questionnaires is essentially the ability to create questions that are going to help you get responses from people. Right? How you ask the questions, that's a different story. If you want to ask via an interview, via a focus group, or just a casual water cooler conversation, you can also do that. Okay? So make sure you open this article and read it in extent. The next article that I'm going to jump in and I'm going to close this week's lecture with is focus groups, some sample questions. And essentially, all I want to do here is free-form it a little bit, and I want to highlight a couple of questions, but I am not going to do a half hour of this. It's going to be a little bit quicker. So essentially, let's look at the top. So there is an example of topic guide on quality service. Okay, so the topic is quality service, and so here are some questions. Impressions of customer service: describe exceptionally good service, describe poor service, differences between public and private service, of course, local office service compared with other public customer services. And of course, this is very focused, so you would have to tweak it to fit your need. But the point is, it's just kind of giving you the ideas. Colloquially, you would definitely form this in a way of a question, so that when you are asking somebody, you are not just making statements. Look at number 10, for example. Missed anything? That's very impersonal. Instead, if you're having an interview, so one-on-one, you could say to the person in a warm manner, do you think I have missed anything, or do you have anything else that you can add, etc. So it's very personable. More words, but it's still more personable than just making the statements, right? The second set over here is questioning route on quality service. So what this is essentially is kind of telling you to have a path. You start with a question, and depending on how the answer goes, then you just take them through a road. So let's look at 3 of them. The first one. In the last few years, we've often heard the words customer service. When you hear this term, what comes to mind? Very open-ended. So question 2. So of course the respondent gives their answer, and that you have to be careful because it can go on a tangent. But then you get to number 2. Think about the last time you experienced exceptionally good service. Regardless of whether you had that experience, what happened that makes you describe your experience as exceptionally good service? So basically, what is that pointer, right? Now, if you go back to the workshop that we did on question creation, you probably will have issues with this question because it's a little complex. And you have to remember Depending on the person and the schooling that that person has, the question may be too heavy for them to comprehend, decode, and answer. So you may end up getting information that is not exactly what you were asking for, which will in the end make you waste time and end up with confused respondents, frustrated respondents. So be careful. Third question, just to finish this example here. Think about a recent experience where you received poor service. What happened that makes you describe your experience as poor? So again, you're routing the person because you're asking them on the topic of customer service, and then you're taking them through the good, the bad, and of course, as you see the other questions, they will go on the same way. This reading is also going to be available for this week, so make sure you open it up and take a read at the rest of the questions. And then the other one that I wanted to talk about is this one. Oh, and by the way, I just made a quick stop over here because I wanted to point this out. The topic guided trend to be used by professional moderators in marketing research studies. So usually you have a person that is already trained, usually psychologists that have the ability to influence people to answer a certain way or in a certain manner, that is, not necessarily to influence them to say something specifically, but instead just to get an answer rather than to get silence or confusion, right? So trained people are already able to do that. But of course, in our case, even though we're not professional data collectors, we are studying to be. So of course, we're going to go on to the second group. So public, nonprofit, and academic environments pretty much use the non-professional moderators. Okay. So now when you put the parts together, let's look at this example over here. This is very interesting. So look at the opening. Tell us your name, and of course this is for it can work for an interview or for a focus group. You just have to moderate it accordingly. So the opening, tell us your name and where you live, a little bit warm up. It sounds very strict and very stern. So usually, a professional facilitator would probably warm it up a little bit more, be a little bit social perhaps, still get that data. Remember, most of the times you have a transcriber or you have a recording machine, so you're going to capture that data no matter what. Then you're going to introduce yourself, you're going to introduce the topic by means of let's level set. In this particular case, the questions that we're looking at are for cholesterol changes. So what to you is good health? That's a good example of a question, grammatically speaking, well constructed. However, once again, depending on the person that you're asking these questions to, the question may sound a little odd or maybe a little confusing. So you have to be careful. A little bit of understanding the people that you're going to reach out to for these questions will give you the upper hand. So after that question in the introduction, then you get into the transition question. What to you is a healthy lifestyle? So notice how it's going from good health in general to healthy lifestyle and to that person, to the respondent. So here's a key point over here, number 4. Think back to the last time you wanted to make a change relating to health. It may have been a change in what you eat, your weight, smoking, or exercise habits. What kind of barriers or roadblocks did you run into? So this is where you start extracting that information. So you've done the opening, you've done the introduction, you've made the transition. Now you're going to the heart of it. You're getting that data. And again, this particular interview or focus group is centered around the cholesterol changes. So we want to know what problems have people experienced or what they have run into in making these changes. Now, we're still in health, so it hasn't gotten into the cholesterol itself. Here's another key, number 5. What helped you or would have helped you the most in making the change? Now we're talking about what is your perspective, what do you think was missing? Then there's another transition, and then you get to more key questions. I'm going to let you guys read these, but that's the reason why I wanted to highlight this particular document. So essentially in this week's conversation, what I wanted to highlight is that the qualitative methodology, as we discussed last week, has definitely its specific strength. And that strength is definitely going to be the questions that you ask, in the way in which you ask them, and how professional are you in asking these questions. But the one thing that I will give you, and I will close with this, from a personal perspective, I can tell you that one gets better responses and more and richer responses by means of building the relationship with the respondent or a group of respondents. So make sure you have that connection before you begin throwing those questions. If we start the questioning line without having warmed up with the respondent, we are going to potentially get very dismayed answers. Lots of silence, lots of frustration, or even people walking out. So take it from somebody who has seen quite a bit of reactions in the past. This week, I'm going to let you guys absorb this, read this documentation, and I'm going to post a question in the discussion board so you can answer it for this week. Until next time, everyone.